Glory Cloud Podcast, episode 67. Well, stay tuned for more law and gospel goodness this week. Well, welcome back to another episode of the Glory Cloud Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Cahy, and I'm joined by our co-host, Charles Lee Irons. Welcome back, Lee.
Hello, Chris. Good to be with you again.
I'm excited about our topic this week, and so to give ourselves maximum time to talk about that, I'll just try to be brief about the regular housekeeping. We do have our show notes page over at meredithkline.com/podcast, and you can find all of the resources that we mentioned in the course of the episode there. I've also added a few goodies that just keep you posted on where we're at in terms of subscriptions and things like that. So head over and check that out. Also, we appreciate all of the 5-star ratings that we continue to get on iTunes. If you haven't done that, that really does help us to be found by people who are looking for good theological content in their podcasts. So please do help us out that way. And if you haven't subscribed, you can subscribe on any podcasting app. That helps us as well. It puts us on the radar of others who are looking for podcasts. And also, if you are able to help out financially, there is a donate button at meredithkline.com/podcast on the right-hand side of the page. And any amount that you can give helps us to cover the monthly cost of hosting the audio files. So we're going to pick up this week on around page 110, where we left off last week. And here, Meredith Kline turns to answering 3 main objections against his sharp contrast between law and gospel, or works and grace.
Yeah, these are 3 objections that he isolated from the writings of Daniel Fuller, John Piper, and Norman Shepherd. So he doesn't explicitly quote these authors when he's responding to these objections, but he's culling these objections from their written materials and trying to summarize their objections to this concept of an Adamic covenant of works, in which Adam was called upon to not only obey God, but to accomplish that decisive act of confronting the serpent and passing the probation, and therefore, and if he had done that, he would have merited the reward of eschatological advancement. So Kline is dealing with the covenant of works, but he's dealing with his understanding of the covenant of works, which implies the concept of the possibility of meriting a reward, which is that's just another way of saying that it was based on the works principle, that if you do the works, then you'll get the reward. And so he's responding to those that critique that and say, no, there's no such thing as a works principle. There's no such thing as a covenant of works in any epic of God's dealings with man, both pre-fall and post-fall. There's no works principle in the Mosaic. There's no works principle in the Adamic covenant. Everything is grace. Sometimes this is called monocovenantalism, the view that there's only one covenant of grace, not going back just to Genesis 3:15, but even before that there's only one covenant of grace from creation on, and that every administration of God's covenant relationship with humans from creation to consummation is a covenant of grace.
Right. So if we're going to talk about a covenant, we can really only talk about grace.
Yeah.
It's an interesting feature of Kingdom Prologue that he doesn't have any footnotes, or if he does, they're extremely rare. Were you able to pinpoint which quote or which objection belonged to which person?
I didn't try.
Okay.
But I could if you want.
Well, I think the ideas are probably more important than the people, because I mean, we continue to encounter them even today in various places.
Mm-hmm.
So let's get started on the first objection, which is that if Adam could merit a reward, he would enrich God by adding to his glory. But this idea of adding to God's glory is impossible.
Yeah, so this objection is an appeal to the very nature of God, and specifically the fact that God is the creator and we're creatures. And as the creator, God is all glorious. But since we're creatures, there's no way that we can add to God's glory. A mere creature can't do anything to add to God's glory. And so the argument is that since it's impossible for a creature like Adam to add to God's glory, based on the creator-creature distinction, therefore, merit has to be eliminated from the Adamic covenant, because the concept of merit would imply that man could enrich God by adding to his glory. Of course, that's the step of the argument that Kline is going to contest. So he agrees with the idea that there's a creator-creature distinction, that God's all glorious, that we can't add to his glory, but he's going to contest that premise that merit means enriching God by adding to his glory.
Right, because he's going to judge it a fundamental misunderstanding of, well, I should say, a fundamental error in how we go about understanding what justice is.
Right. Yeah, he would say that one of the terms he likes to use in this on page 111 is this idea of covenantal justice. And so part of the reason why the objectors think that merit, the concept of pre-fall Adamic merit, would lead to enriching God by adding to his glory, the reason they think that is because they have a certain definition of justice that is based on an abstract weighing of things, and saying that that there's some sort of abstract merit that can be weighed apart from the covenant relationship, and then that merit is then rewarded by God, and then that enriches God and expands his glory in some way. And Kline would say, not only do we need to define justice covenantally and not abstractly, but we need to understand that this is how God set it up. God set up his relationship with Adam precisely this way, so that he was calling for Adam to obey him. And in fact, Kline would appeal here to the very concept of, like the Westminster Shorter Catechism, right? Man was created to glorify God. And how is man to glorify God? Not by adding to God's glory, but by obeying God.
Right. That would bring glory to God if Adam did what God made him to do.
Right. And so if we define justice in that sense, as in a covenantal context, that God created man to glorify God by obeying him within the context of this covenant, then there's no problem with saying that Adam could merit a reward, because the justice of God simply demands that if man performs the stipulated works in that covenant, then he should receive the reward that's promised in that covenant.
One of Kline's favorite critiques is to point out that his interlocutors are thinking about things too abstractly. They're being abstract in their mm-hmm. reasoning, and it's as if they've stepped outside of the biblical data, and they're just saying, well, premise 1, premise 2, therefore conclusion. And he's saying, but if we get into the biblical data itself and look at what Genesis 1 and 2 say about this covenant that God had created Adam and Eve into, and what he's commanded them to do in the context of that covenant, it really shouldn't be jarring or problematic to mm-hmm. see that, as we've seen in the past few weeks, that this eschatological reward is offered to Adam for his successful probation in the covenant.
Right. And that it was supposed to happen, that there was supposed to be an eschatological advancement from the state in which he was created to a more glorious state of being glorified. And this advancement was built into the very image of God. Remember, we talked about the three aspects of the image of God, the functional, the ethical, and the physical. And that physical one, the third point, which is sometimes called luminosity, that is the eschatological goal that was embedded within the image of God from the get-go. So it wasn't as if Adam is somehow trying to add to God's glory. It's simply he is being called upon by means of obedience and passing the probation to attain the created goal that God had set before him from the very beginning.
Exactly. And we've talked previously about how it would actually have been unjust of God and actually a curse if Adam had not realized that eschatological state by means of passing that probation.
Mm-hmm. I also like how Kline appeals to Romans 8:30 here. The famous passage, those whom he foreknew, he also predestined. Those whom he predestined, he also called. Those whom he called, he also justified. Those whom he justified, he also glorified. And that last connection there, the last step from justification to glorification, Kline says that we can take that concept and we can apply it to Adam in the pre-redemptive context. Because what Paul is talking about, of course, is in the redemptive context. But the implication of what Paul is saying is that those who are justified, that is, those who are declared righteous, who are reckoned as righteous, have a right and title to glorification. Glorification is not like an added grace or something. It is the reward of being righteous. If you are righteous, then you deserve to be glorified.
Right.
And so there's this bond, this tight linkage between justification and glorification.
I really think that's what Paul's doing in Romans 5 as well. I mean, he uses that term justification there applied to Christ in contrast to the condemnation that Adam brought about. But the idea is that it could have been Adam's. Right? The justification could have belonged to Adam had he obeyed.
No, that's a really good point. I'm glad that you are making that connection, because what you're showing is that when Kline sees that bond between justification and glorification in Romans 8, he's not making it up to apply it to Adam, because Paul himself had made that connection a few chapters earlier.
Right.
In Romans 5 and verse 18, let me read it to you from the NIV, which I like in this particular case. It says, consequently, just as the result of, this is the 1984 NIV, not the 2011. Consequently, just as the result of one trespass was condemnation for all men, so also the result of one act of righteousness was justification that brings life for all men. I like that phrase, justification that brings life.
Right.
In Greek, it's just the justification of life, the genitive of life, but the NIV is correctly interpreting that genitive to say, this is what it means. It's justification that brings life.
And there's the connection between justification and glorification right there.
Yeah, exactly. Kline talks about this. He uses this phrase on page 112. There's a judicial eschatological bonding of glorification to justification.
I love it. That's rich.
And furthermore, we could also tie this back to Romans 2:13, where earlier in Romans, Paul uses the word justify in a covenant of works context. For it is not those who hear the law who are righteous in God's sight, but those who obey the law, those who do the law, who will be justified. who will be declared righteous. So doing the law, there's two ways you can be justified, in other words. You can be justified by faith because of the righteousness of Christ, or you can be justified by doing the law, by fulfilling the terms of the covenant of works.
Right. And I mean, as we're tracking with Paul as sinners on the other side of the fall, we're reading Romans 2 going, oh my goodness, who then can be saved?
Right. So we end up realizing that it's an empty set. There is no one that keeps the law perfectly in order to be justified thereby. And Paul himself says that. Romans 3, 9 and 10, there is none righteous. So it's an empty set, but it's still a theoretical possibility.
Mm-hmm.
And before the fall for Adam, it was a very, very live possibility that if he had obeyed God, kept the law, passed the probation, he would have been justified. And then he would have been glorified on the basis of that justification, because he, being righteous, he would then have the right and title to glorification.
Absolutely. So, I mean, there's nothing in Genesis 1 and 2 that would offer any help to this objection. And then on top of that, we have God's own interpretation in Paul's inspired writings that tell us, no, we're reading Genesis 1 and 2 correctly, that God would actually have rewarded Adam with glorification. Yeah,
I think that this, if you really want to get to the bottom of what this objection is saying, I think, I'm trying to understand it, but I think the heart of what they're saying is that they don't agree with Kline's understanding that this advancing from a mutable state in which Adam was capable of sinning and capable of dying, and then advancing beyond that to a confirmed state, beyond probation, and then having the right and title to glorification, and then being glorified, it seems as though they don't agree with Kline that was God's intent from the very beginning. It seems that, right? Because it seems like they're saying, if Adam could merit a reward, that would enrich God by adding to his glory, as if there was some new thing that Adam is coming to God and saying, okay, now I'm demanding that you give me this glory, as if God hadn't planned it all along, as if it wasn't part of God's whole intent, that's what God was doing when he made this creature in his own image. He was making a creature that could advance to that if he obeyed, and that would bring God glory.
Right.
Not adding to God's glory, but this is exactly the point, that God created man to glorify himself through this process.
Almost like they're accusing Adam of building his own Tower of Babel before the fall.
Yeah, exactly. As if he's the one that came up with this idea of, hey, I got this great idea. I can advance to eschatological glory, so I'm going to go to God and do this merit, and then go to God and say, now, God, you have to give me this. I know you didn't think of this, but now I'm demanding it from you,
Yeah.
Which is ridiculous. I mean, it misses the whole point. I mean, it's just completely blind to the eschatological fabric of the whole Scripture.
Absolutely. Eschatology.
This is everything. This eschatology is everything. This is what God had in view from the very beginning. And then when he accomplishes it through Christ, it's not some new thing that wouldn't have happened apart from Christ. It's that he's doing it through a mediator. He's doing it through a substitute, through a second Adam. But that was the goal from the beginning.
Right. I'm so glad you made that point. I refer to it in The Tale of Two Adams as eschatology being the tie that binds, but I love the way you put it as it being the fabric of all of this. And if you miss that eschatological fabric that runs through all of Scripture, then you're left with all these disparate stories that you have to try to cobble together on your own. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, and then you're just left with moralism, because then the whole Bible is just about how you need to obey and be a good person. And I mean, you could even try to make that sound good and say it's all sanctification by grace and so on, but it ends up being about you and about what you have to do, instead of about this great glorious goal that God is accomplishing. And he's doing it through his Son, who became man, in order to undertake the eschatological burden that Adam dropped and to carry it to it's like, I guess, like a football image or something, so they drop the football, but somebody comes in and picks it up and takes it to the end zone. So,
right. So, and I'm glad you made that point too, that even though we are standing firm with Kline on this point that, no, this meritorious situation was real and live for Adam in the garden before the fall. Ultimately, at the end of the day, the point is Christ and his obedience and the fact that he accomplished what God assigned to Adam so that we could realize that eschatological goal.
Exactly. That's why Kline is so exercised about this. It's not just some obscure, pedantic debate over whether or not there was a possibility for Adam to merit before the fall, and it's like people will say, well, why are we even debating this? Because we know it didn't happen anyway. Adam sinned, so why are you even debating it? Who cares? It's just purely hypothetical, right? Well, no, it's important because then it informs your understanding of what Christ has done. And so if you miss this, then you're going to miss it's like you're if you don't understand the way that the house is built in terms of the frame, the foundation and the frame, then you won't be able to apply the walls and the roof and all the surfaces and all the decoration and everything correctly. The frame has to be there. The fundamental legal structure, which is the frame of the house and the foundation of the house, has to be correctly understood and correctly built. Otherwise, all the adornment and the roof and everything else will fall.
Right.
And so this idea that there was a possibility for Adam to merit the reward of eschatological advancement by passing the probation, and that it would have been on the basis of strict justice and not on the basis of grace if he had done that. That is the frame. And so we got to make sure we have the frame right. We're not debating details. We're debating the essence of the gospel, so that when Christ comes along, we can see how he does it, how he undertakes to fulfill what Adam failed to do and brings about that eschatological reward through his merit.
That's right.
So if you deny the merit of Adam, or the possibility that Adam could have merited, then you're denying the merit of Christ.
Absolutely, which we will see in some of these other objections as well.
Yes. And that'll become a note that we will hammer in this episode until you're tired of it. No, we're not going to be tired of it. We're going to rejoice in it every time.
Okay, shall we move on to the second objection?
Yeah,
okay.
Second objection.
So, objection number 2, God's goodness as shown to Adam in the creational covenant was unmerited grace.
Yes. So this is another thing that you sometimes hear from the monocovenantalists, and they want to say that grace was present in the pre-fall arrangement with Adam before the fall, and they're kind of getting at something that is true because God's goodness was shown to Adam before the fall, but then they kind of slide over sort of an equivocation on terms. They sort of slide from goodness to unmerited grace. So if they can get their foot in the door with goodness, God's goodness to Adam, then they can say, well, therefore that's unmerited grace. And then, well, then that means that there's no such thing as pre-fall merit. And so Kline responds to this by basically doing some linguistic analysis of these words. What is grace? What is goodness? And let's sort of be careful here with our terminology.
Right. And I just wanted to add to what you were just saying there, that we have talked about this in previous episodes too, that, I mean, it's kind of starting with the idea that unmerited grace is this idea that we didn't do anything to deserve X, Y, or Z. And so they're taking that, not having done something to deserve, and applying it to Adam and saying, well, he hadn't done anything to deserve being created. He hadn't done anything to deserve having this lush garden where he could eat of any tree except the one, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, that's right. We had a whole episode. It was episode 24 on Kline's definition of grace, and we were basically camping out right here in this section of Kingdom Prologue, pages 112 to 114. But
Kline is, to go back to your analogy of the frame of the house, he's camping out on that idea, I guess, and saying, no, this is a legal and forensic frame that we're dealing with, and grace can only exist within that frame.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he would say, I love this quote here on page 112. He would say that grace lives and moves and has its being in a legal forensic environment. And so what he's saying is that if you want to understand grace correctly, he's going to really be precise in how he defines grace. You have to define it in the context of a covenant of works. That is, in the context of a legal forensic environment where there is a works principle at work, where if you disobey, you're judged. If you obey, you're rewarded. Grace presupposes that framework. If you don't have that framework in view, you can't talk about grace.
Or that it's unintelligible.
Right.
Yeah. So, so then grace and works are antonyms, right? And go ahead.
Yeah, he's basically at that point, he's saying, look, just look at the way the term grace is used in the New Testament,
right?
Especially in Paul. He always contrasts it with works.
Absolutely. And I mean, I've looked at Galatians 3 before, and you can almost write a 2-column chart and, put Paul's grace words on one side and Paul's works words on another side. And I mean, he's just laying out an argument that it's either column A or column B, but there's no column C that's some sort of admixture of the two.
Right. Exactly. Romans 11:6, if it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of works. Otherwise, grace would no longer be grace.
Exactly.
So that's a really strong point that Kline is making here. He's appealing to the biblical usage. And he's saying, okay, if that's the case, then if grace and works are antonyms in Paul's lexicon, then that means that in some way they must be comparable with each other. They're not obviously comparable in the sense of being like each other. They're comparable in the sense of being the opposite of each other.
Right.
But if they're comparable in the sense of being the opposite of each other, and if works clearly is a forensic term, then grace must be a forensic term as well.
And so it's the forensic there that really is the framework for understanding the contrast.
Right.
If two things are contrasted, there has to be some underlying factor that provides the context for that contrast. And here it's the forensic.
And by forensic, we just mean having to do with God as the judge.
Right.
The judge who, in his justice, is rewarding those who are righteous and punishing those who are wicked.
Has to do with the law and courtrooms and things like that.
Yeah. So if works is forensic, that is, you are doing works and presenting them before the judicial court of God, and then God is looking at them, evaluating them, and saying they're good, they're holy, they're perfect, they're righteous. Here's the reward that deserves. Then grace must also be in a forensic context, because grace and works are antonyms, as we saw in Romans 11:6 and the passage in Galatians that you talked about. So grace must also be defined then in terms of this metaphor of God as the judge and you're bringing yourself before him. But now, since it's grace, the opposite of works, what is that then? In the courtroom scenario, it's God in his mercy granting you the positive reward, even though you have deserved the curse. and the judgment.
Right. And that's really the scandalous point, I think, that might bother some of Kline's objectors. That it's in spite of the demerit, in spite of the sin.
But his point is if you agree with his argument so far, step 1, grace and works are antonyms. Step 2, works is understood in a forensic or judicial context. Therefore, conclusion, grace must also be understood in a judicial context. If you follow the logic, then you have to admit that grace is God's responding to a situation of sin and a situation where the person deserves punishment but actually gets a reward instead, reward of blessing instead. And then if you agree to that definition, if you followed all along to that and you come to that point in the argument, then it's clear that you cannot say that there was grace before the fall, because before the fall there was no sin.
Right. Exactly.
That's what he's driving at.
But as we're about to get into in the next section, when he finishes up discussing these objections, he's going to get into judgment and the situation that we find in Genesis chapter 3. And so I guess I say that in this context to say that God's judgment is a real and live situation. Even before the fall, there would have been judgment. But here we're making the point that it can be by the principle of works, or God's judgment can be by the principle of grace.
Right.
And the judgment that Adam would have faced and did face in Genesis 3 was by the principle of works. Right.
Judgment by the principle of works would be that God would grant his promised blessings that were held out in the covenant of works as the reward for Adam's meritorious obedience, or conversely, he would have, and he actually did end up giving the curse as the punishment for Adam's disobedience. But a judgment by the principle of works is taking place when either of those things is happening, when either blessing is being given for obedience or curse is being issued for disobedience. That's a judgment by the principle of works.
It really is that Leviticus 18:5 principle, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which states the positive, do this and live, but I guess the other side of that coin would be don't do this and die.
Mm-hmm. Or Deuteronomy 27:26, cursed is the one that does not continue in all the things written in the book of the law to do them.
There you go. And so Kline has an interesting thing that he says on bottom of page 113, top of page 114. In the only situation where merit enters the picture, that is, in connection with human response to divine demand, there is either merit or demerit. In the situation of accountable response to covenant duty, obedience brings merit, and failure to perform the probationary task incurs demerit. So I just appreciate how crystal clear he is there about the principle of justice.
Yeah. And he's basically saying that we shouldn't use the term unmerited grace.
Right.
Because the idea of unmerited is sort of a strange neutral term that doesn't fit into the either or option here. There's either merit or demerit. There's no such thing as unmerit.
Right.
And so, if we're talking about a situation of judgment by the principle of works, either there's merit because the works have been done, or there's demerit because disobedience has occurred. But there's no such thing as unmerited grace.
You're right. And in fact, if you read just past that quote, he says, there is no unmerit.
There you go. That's right.
But in contrast to that principle of justice, judgment by the principle of grace would be, as you've said before, this idea that the ultimate blessing is bestowed to sinners in the face of their sin or in face of their disobedience.
Yeah, in spite of their demerit.
Right.
In other words, he's saying to use the word grace biblically in a Pauline way, you have to have demerit there in the background. Grace can only come into the picture when there's demerit. Demerit meaning actual transgression and disobedience and sin, breaking of the covenant, that is worthy of judgment and punishment. But in spite of that, God in his mercy and his grace grants the blessing that was promised, even though man doesn't deserve it. That's judgment by the principle of grace. So going back to the objection, quote, God's goodness as shown to Adam in the creational covenant was unmerited grace. Therefore, there is no such thing as a covenant of works that involve merit before the fall. Kline's response, your definition of grace is unbiblical. You're defining grace as some sort of neutral, unmerited thing, but there's no such thing as unmerited grace. All there is grace in the face of demerit.
So grace can only come to human beings on the other side of the fall. It can only come to sinners.
Right. Grace isn't even a concept before the fall.
Right.
I like the way Kline says, okay, let's define it then. What is grace? He says, he gives a longer definition and a shorter definition. The longer definition is on page 112. He says it's a divine favor, a divine response of favor and blessing in the face of human violation of obligation. The shorter definition is even better. Page 113, it's a response of mercy to demerit.
Mm. And it struck me recently as I heard a sermon that we can maybe become desensitized in our use of the term grace, but when we read especially Jesus's parables, many times, if we were to get ourselves into the shoes of the people who were hearing Jesus tell those parables, we might actually be offended by this response of grace, because the principle of justice would cause us to stand up and shake our fists and say, no, this person deserves punishment.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely.
I mean, I think of like the prodigal son and the Good Samaritan. All those stories are, involve people who the hearers would have decided as they were hearing the story, there's nothing redeemable about, the person that this story is about. This person should receive God's ultimate judgment, and yet they get God's ultimate blessing in spite of that. Yeah. So,
yeah, it kind of goes back to our childhood feelings of that's not fair.
Exactly.
We've all experienced that when we were kids, where you did the right thing. You stood in line the whole time, or whatever, to get the thing, and then some other kid jumps in and gets the toy or something, and it's like, that's not fair. or just all these little feelings that you have as a kid, and it just wells up inside of you, And I think that the Pharisees were kind of expressing that same feeling. They've worked so hard to be obedient. They've worked so hard to keep the law in excruciating detail. And then along come these tax collectors and prostitutes, and they just get off scot-free. And it's like, come on, that's not fair.
Right. Exactly.
But that's what grace, if grace is true grace, that's what's going to, that carnal response will naturally arise in your heart, because it isn't fair. It's not, God is not dispensing the blessings of the covenant on the basis of the works principle. He's dispensing them on the basis of sheer grace and his response of mercy in the face of demerit.
Yeah, as sinners, we don't want God to be fair.
There's a great quote here on page 113. Kline says that, talking now about how we see grace in the work of redemption through Christ as the second Adam, he says, the grace of Christ comes to expression in his active and passive obedience, together constituting a vicarious satisfaction for the obligations and liabilities of his people, who through failure and transgression are debtors before the covenant Lord, the judge of all the earth. A vicarious satisfaction for the obligations and the liabilities. Obligations, we're obligated to keep the law, and the liabilities, we have incurred God's wrath because we've broken the law, and Christ vicariously satisfies both through his active and passive obedience. Through his active obedience, he satisfies the obligations. Through his passive obedience, he satisfies for the liabilities.
And the second person of the Trinity knew that about us before he became one of us.
Well, he became one of us precisely to do that.
Well, exactly. But I mean,
yeah.
I think about that, and I think about everything that Christ endured during his life, which, I mean, thank God that he was the second person of the Trinity, because if any one of us were in his position, we would have just gotten frustrated and said, forget you guys.
Yeah.
I'm going home.
Yeah, that's true. That's his love.
Right.
He demonstrated his love for us in doing that, in graciously taking up our obligations and liabilities, satisfying God's justice in our place. And the debt that we owe to God for our sins is so enormous. It's just this massive debt. I mean, we can't even comprehend it because we can't comprehend how holy God is. But if we really understood the holiness of God, we would see that all of our sins have racked up this enormous debt that we could never pay.
Right.
We would never be able to pay it. But Christ has undertaken for us to pay that debt in our place. And so that is where grace comes into play. Now we see what grace is. Did Adam have this enormous liability before the fall? No.
No.
So then there's no talk of grace at that point. Grace is when Christ undertakes the liability in our place.
Yeah, God wasn't offering to give Adam something in spite of anything.
Mm-mm. So Kline says, divine grace directs itself not merely to the absence of merit, but to the presence of demerit. Oh, that's a good one, right? Just zings it right there. Bam.
Well, that's also attacking the idea of unmerited anything.
Yeah.
Because there's no third way there. There's either merit or demerit.
Because Kline would agree that Adam lacked merit prior to the confrontation with the serpent. But that's not grace. Grace is not something that's given in the absence of merit. Grace is God's goodness given in the presence of demerit. And Adam did not have that.
Right. Going back to that childhood sense of indignation, and it's not fair. Mm-hmm. And yet, right at that moment, right in that situation, giving the gift, the blessing, that is not fair.
Yeah. So going back to the objection again, they say God's goodness is the same as God's unmerited grace. God's goodness shown to Adam before the fall. And then so Kline circles back and says, okay, we've defined grace as a response of mercy in the face of demerit. But what is goodness then? So he defines God's goodness as something distinct from grace. He acknowledges that the very act of creation was a remarkable display of God's love and goodness, and even he uses the term beneficence, which I think just means the same thing as goodness.
Right.
So he'll acknowledge all of that, but don't call that grace, is all he's saying.
Right. We shouldn't shy away from saying that God was good to Adam, that he showed love to Adam. I even like...
He didn't have to create Adam.
Exactly. I was just going to say, I like Horton's, the way he puts it, that God was extravagant. Mm-hmm. He wasn't obligated to do anything that he did. But here he is lavishing all of this goodness and love on Adam, but Adam still hadn't done the sin, the violation of God's covenant that would have then provided the context to talk about grace.
Right. Yeah.
And so Kline says that it would amount to mischief to use the term grace to describe God's creational goodness.
Yeah. Brings back memories, doesn't it?
It does.
Of the classroom. Yeah, in the classroom, he would use the word mischief a lot.
But I think what he means there is that then we can become confused if we use the word grace about Adam before the fall. And then if we're applying that same word to ourselves after the fall, does it open the door for us to think of ourselves in terms of Adam's pre-fall state? It blurs lines that aren't helpful. Yeah.
It leads to, when you're not careful with your words and defining them properly and precisely, the way Kline is trying to do here with defining grace, if you're not careful, it confuses your mind. And then pretty soon you can end up confusing the gospel itself.
Right.
There's a great paragraph here on page 114 where the word mischief is used in the middle of it. He says, unfortunately, however, gospel grace has been commonly defined by the term unmerited. Then, when unmerited is also used for the divine benevolence in creation, an illusion of similarity, if not identity, is produced. As a result, the term grace gets applied to God's creational goodness, and the mischief culminates in the argument that since grace, quote unquote, is built into the human situation at the outset, the covenant that ordered man's existence could not be a covenant of works.
There we go.
So he's showing how not being clear in our terms can lead to confusion. And then, of course, if you deny the covenant of works, then you're tearing down that structure that the house is built on for understanding the work of Christ as his meritorious accomplishment of the active and passive obedience that secures the eschatological reward for his people.
Absolutely. And I think that segues perfectly into the third objection. The third objection is that the disproportion between Adam's work and the promised blessing forbids us to speak of simple justice. So this is a pernicious one, but the idea is that there's something about Adam as a creature, and then the work that a creature can do that simply rules out simple justice as the operating principle in all of this. Right.
Yeah, this is a pernicious one, and it reminds me of that book, Merit and Moses.
Yes.
Because in there, the authors their main attack in that book is on Kline's view of the Mosaic covenant and republication, but they also spend quite a bit of time dealing with the Adamic covenant. And they want to argue that any merit that Adam might have been able to achieve before the fall, if he had passed the probation, would not be genuine merit. And this is the argument that they use, is this disproportion argument. Because Adam's a creature and God is the creator, and so any work that he does can't be inherently worthy of the promised reward.
I hear some echoes of the first objection in this one.
Yeah, it is definitely connected to the first one. But yeah, one of the verses that this objection appeals to is that famous passage in the Gospel of Luke, Luke 17:10, where it says, "So you also, when you have done all that you were commanded, say, 'We are unworthy servants. We have only done what was our duty.'"
And I know from reading, I can't even remember the name of Shepherd's book now, but The Call of Grace.
Yeah.
That was a favorite verse for him. And unfortunately, I've even read it in quite a few Reformed theologians from the history of Reformed theology. But let's unpack this. What's this all about?
Yeah. Well, it's saying that that Adam's finite obedience is too limited and too small to properly balance. I guess the idea is looking at merit and reward as like scales, and on one scale you have the merit, the obedience, and on the other scale you have the reward. And so what's Adam being asked to do? Well, it's a finite obedience, not only the obedience of a creature, so it's by definition finite, but it's also limited in time because he needs to obey for however long until he confronts the serpent. And then once he does that work, then he's done and he's passed the probation, and that's a finite span of time. But over on the other side of the scale, you have this reward of everlasting life that's eternal and infinite. And so a finite obedience and an eternal reward don't balance. And so therefore it can't really be, there's a disproportion between the work and the reward. So therefore it can't really be true merit. It has to be some kind of improper merit or congruous merit or something like that, where God is graciously condescending to accept the obedience as if it were meritorious, even though it's not really meritorious.
And it almost seems to be a bit of rationalism. I mean, just starting with this a priori idea that the finite cannot earn the infinite.
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think you're right.
Like there's something about Adam's being that just is inherently unworthy of heaven.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Kline responds to this, though, by pointing out that they're inconsistent because they admit that Adam's finite disobedience earned the punishment of everlasting death.
Exactly. So if you're going to say that Adam's obedience wasn't weighty enough, to use your scale analogy, to earn everlasting life, then why is his disobedience weighty enough to earn eternal death, everlasting death?
Yeah.
I've always been impressed by that argument.
And so to be consistent, they would have to say that God's really not being just to punish sin with everlasting death. That's really excessive. It's not just.
Whoa, God, come on.
Because finite disobedience should earn finite punishment.
Right.
The scale should be equal. And so eternal death can't be the proper just reward for a finite disobedience. And then Kline even takes it a step further and twisting the screws even harder on them and says, to be consistent, the objectors should charge God with injustice not only for punishing sinners with everlasting hell, but for exacting that same punishment from his son.
Oh, that's right. it must be on either page 114 or 115, but he talks about how then, top of page 115, the cross would be the ultimate act of divine injustice.
Yeah.
That is the theologically disastrous outcome of blurring the works-grace contrast by appealing to a supposed disproportionality between work and reward.
Yeah.
And so...
Yeah, that's pretty strong.
Very strong. But this again goes back to, we didn't use the word epistemology when we were talking about the first objection, but I think that's involved in both of these. And they're both attempting to start with a principle that they're just going to announce and then work from that principle.
Yeah.
But Kline is saying, no, we have to know what God's justice means by looking at what God reveals.
Right.
And what God builds into his covenant.
Right. It goes back to that phrase, covenantal justice.
Right.
That the covenant is the only way that we have access to justice. We don't have access through some other ontological measuring scale. We only have access to it and understanding what the scale of justice is by looking at how God has revealed it in the covenant, specifically the covenant of works.
And so I love what he says also on page 115, that God's covenant word is the definer of justice.
Yeah.
And I've really found your contribution to Kline's Festschrift helpful this way, redefining merit. Because you're dealing with these ideas and also situating them in the context of the medieval discussion about merit, which is where the Protestant Reformation came on the scene, was in that medieval context.
Yeah, exactly. In the medieval context, they were talking about merit as a soteriological concept, that sinners can actually merit eternal life by doing good works. Not perfect, not complete, not it's not true strict merit, but it's some sort of congruous merit when through the use of the sacraments and by the grace of God, we become more obedient and then, quote unquote, merit salvation or merit eternal life. It's kind of shocking to us now, but it's actually in the Council of Trent, in their document, they use that term merit, and they're using it in a soteriological sense. But of course, to do that, they have to redefine merit as something not ontologically strict, so they define it as this lower merit. But they get that idea by comparing it with this more abstract concept of merit, where the obedience and the reward are equal. Again, going back to that analogy of the scales. And then they say, well, in this case, the merit that we're trying to argue for that sinners can have in order to be saved is actually not equal. And so it's a lesser form of merit called congruous merit. Unfortunately, I believe that in my paper that you're talking about, I argue that, unfortunately, a lot of the Reformed theologians adopted that concept, not in applying it to soteriology, but applying it to the pre-fall situation. And so they agreed with that distinction that the medieval theologians made between condign merit, that's the one where the scales are equal, and congruous merit, where it's not equal, but God graciously accepts it on the basis of the covenant that he condescended to make. And so they took that concept from the medieval theologians, took it out of the soteriological context, of course, because they rejected merit for salvation, but then they applied it incorrectly, in my view, to the pre-fall situation, to Adam. And Kline says no to that. He rejects that distinction between condign and congruous merit.
Absolutely.
He says that's a false distinction, because there is no such thing as condign merit the way you've defined it, as this equality of the ontological scales. The only justice there is covenant justice. Mm-hmm. God's covenant word is the definer of justice. That's the only justice. That's the only merit there is.
And so when many of those Reformed theologians turn to talk about justification, they really got it right. And I think that points out that there's a real tension there in the tradition that I think Kline does us a huge service by taking that tension away in terms of understanding justice more biblically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So how then does this ontological view of what Adam's obedience would have been worth, how does that blur the law-gospel distinction?
Well, obviously, it blurs the law-gospel distinction by denying that there is a contrast between these two things, between law and gospel. It's saying that there is no such thing as a works principle. Even that it's denying that structure that the house is built under. Mm-hmm. And it's saying there is no, that the whole structure that you set up of saying that you have to obey in order to receive the reward, and if you disobey, you're going to receive the curse. That whole structure that you set up is false, and that the gospel is, and then that of course means you've redefined the gospel, because now the gospel is not that Christ vicariously substitutes and fulfills our obligations and undertakes our liabilities under that covenant of works, but that now the gospel is simply going back to the medieval idea that we were just talking about a minute ago of do the best that you can, and God will reward you on the basis of his grace. And so it ends up, by denying the law-gospel contrast, by denying the contrast between the works principle and the substitutionary principle of grace, then it ends up leading to a blurring of works and faith. And it's saying that we are not justified by faith alone, that is trusting in the substitute, but rather we're justified by faith as well as the works that flow from faith, and that this faith/works continuum is what God graciously accepts in order to grant us the reward. And so what Kline is arguing then is that you have to have the law-gospel contrast in order to maintain the works-faith contrast. And if you don't have the works-faith contrast, you can't articulate the concept that we're justified by faith alone apart from works. And so you end up denying justification by faith alone and drifting back towards Rome. Because that's what faith is. Faith is not a work that God accepts in place of perfect obedience. Faith is trusting in and resting in the satisfaction of another.
Absolutely. And that probably goes a long way toward explaining the burden of that book, Merit and Moses. I mean, they understood that there was a lot of work demanded of Israel, and that there was a lot of, frankly, sin instead of that work being done, but they had to try to account for the relationship in the Mosaic covenant between that work and the faith principle that was there in the sacrificial system, and in terms of calling individual sinners to trust in the coming Messiah. But yeah, it does end up blurring works and faith.
Mm-hmm. And it also ends up, logically, you end up denying the concept of this vicarious substitutionary undertaking of the obligations and the liabilities concept that we were talking about. Because if you really believe that there is no structure, the 2x4s are not set up this way that the one who does these things will live. And if you don't do these things, if you disobey, you'll be under a curse. If you don't believe in that structure, then you don't need Christ to come in and take our place and undertake for us what Adam failed to do, and also to undertake the curse that he brought upon us. And so logically then, if you deny the law-gospel contrast, if you hold to monocovenantalism and deny that the Adamic covenant was a covenant based on the works principle, then you end up denying substitutionary atonement, and you have to logically deny the idea of federal representation, that Christ is our federal head, our representative, and that what he accomplished under the terms of his covenant, which is not the Adamic covenant per se, but it's the eternal covenant between the Father and the Son, the covenant of redemption, or the Pactum Salutis, but the accomplishment of his obedience and righteousness under that covenant is then imputed to those whom he represents. So if you deny the works principle, you cannot also say, but I still want to hold to this idea of Christ being our federal head and that his righteousness is imputed to us.
Absolutely. I want to be clear, though, for our listeners, that I don't think that the authors of Merit and Moses reject substitutionary atonement. I think that what we're saying in this episode is that if you say that the works principle was absent from the covenant in the covenant of creation, then you've cut out theologically, in terms of systematic theology, you've cut out the possibility of Christ being our substitute and bearing the very curse that we inherited from Adam.
No, I agree with you. Yeah, the authors of that book don't deny penal substitution, but what Kline is arguing is that to be consistent,
right?
He's looking at the consistency here.
Yes.
If you reject the works principle, and of course, some people will accept the works principle with Adam, but reject it with Moses. Other people will reject it in both places. But if you object to the works principle in principle, and you don't believe in that concept that there is a works principle, then you cannot accept. You have no logical basis to maintain the idea of the imputation of the righteousness of Christ as our federal head. And so to give you an example of somebody who would be consistent in this would be someone like N.T. Wright. N.T. Wright totally rejects the covenant of works and totally rejects the imputation of Christ's righteousness. He believes that Christ had to die for our sins and that because of the atonement we're forgiven, but he rejects this concept of the imputation of a positive righteousness to us. He calls that medieval merit mongering, and as if that Christ creates this treasury of merit that can then be applied to the elect. He rejects that, so he would be an example of somebody who's consistent on this point. The Merit and Moses authors don't take it that far, but because I think that they would accept the works principle with the Adamic covenant, but not with the Mosaic. So that's good. That means that they still have some basis for acknowledging the idea of federal representation.
Right. And yet they do seem to be chipping away at the principle of merit. They
chip away at it by saying that even though they accept the works principle with Adam, yet when they define what Adam's merit would have looked like, they call it a lesser form of merit, congruous merit, and not strict merit. And so that you're right, it does sort of chip away at the foundations. I think there's still a structure there and a foundation there, but they're beginning to chip away at it. I don't think that they understand the implications of what that chipping away does.
Right. We're thankful that they do hold to penal substitution and to the imputation of Christ's righteousness, but
right.
So what's
There's a great quote on the bottom of page 116 where Kline says, "This standard doctrine of probation and imputation is obviously not compatible with the position that disavows the works principle. On that position, a declaration of justification and conveyance of eschatological blessings in consequence of a successful probation, whether of Adam or Christ, would be an exercise of grace, not of simple justice." But if there is no meritorious accomplishment possible, the rationale of the imputation arrangement in general becomes obscure if the whole point of it is not in fact lost. In the case of the gospel, if there is no meritorious achievement of active obedience on the part of Christ to be imputed to the elect, then this cardinal doctrine of soteric justification in its historic orthodox form must be abandoned, as someone like N.T. Wright does abandon it.
He really could see 12 steps ahead to the implications of someone's theological position.
Yeah. And just to make this contemporary, just today, I was browsing on Facebook and I came across this link to an article by Michael Bird, Why I Believe in Monocovenantalism. And
it's still around.
And there it is. And this is exactly what Kline is concerned about. And he breaks it down very clearly and says, there is no covenant of works which required Adam to keep a law that was a protological version of the Mosaic law. And he also says that he defines salvation as restoring the ruined relationship between Creator and humanity, as opposed to accruing the meritorious law-keeping that Adam allegedly failed to achieve. So there you have it. He's denying the works principle. He's denying the Mosaic, the Adamic covenant of works, the Mosaic republication, and he's denying that Christ meritoriously kept the law for us.
Right. Imputation is gone.
Imputation's gone. So there you see it. You see the logical outworkings of it.
Wow. The
covenant of grace, properly understood, allows us to correlate, not confuse, law and gospel.
Continuum, not contrast.
The Mosaic law is antithetical to gospel only when the law is regarded as a means of salvation, when it's misused.
I confess that I don't understand the argument that Paul's talking about a misunderstanding of the Mosaic law.
No, because then why would Christ have to die under it and become a curse for us? If that's just a misunderstanding. He didn't die for a misunderstanding.
Right.
He didn't take the curse of a misunderstanding. He became a curse. Because cursed is everyone that does not continue in all things written in the book of the law to do them. He actually took the curse of the law for us, not the curse of a misunderstanding.
Amen.
Which is actually what James Dunn in his commentary actually glosses it that way, that he took the curse of the misunderstanding of the law.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. So
there's no comfort in that.
No.
But there is comfort in this idea that Christ is the second and the last Adam who came to not only pay the penalty of the sin that we deserve to bear, but to also obey the law perfectly every single second of every single day, such that God counts Jesus's obedience as if it were our obedience.
Ah, wonderful.
And that's why hanging on to the principle of merit and justice is so important.
God looks at us not only as if we had never sinned. That's pretty good in itself, but even more, he looks on us as if we have accomplished the positive righteousness that was required, and as if we have done all that God required to be done, all that God required Adam to do. He looks at us as if we've done all of that in Christ. And therefore, we are looked at as those that deserve the reward, even though we don't deserve it in ourselves. But he treats us as those who have merited eschatological advancement.
It sounds too good to be true. But it is true. I mean, it's what Paul was constantly hammering away at.
Mm-hmm.
So then, as through one transgression there resulted condemnation to all men, even so through one act of righteousness there resulted justification of life to all men.
Oh.
There's our hope right there.
Mm-hmm. Amen. It's wonderful. As Machen said, I'm so thankful for the active obedience of Christ. No hope without it.
That's right. Yep. And Kline included that telegram message in his Covenant Theology Under Attack essay, which is completely relevant to what we've been talking about here too.
Mm-hmm.
So
absolutely, yeah. And we'll link to that in the show notes.
Okay. Any other concluding thoughts?
No, I think that's enough for us to chew on and rejoice in and be thankful for.
Yes. Thank you, Lord, for the active obedience of Christ. All right. Thank you, everyone, for bearing with us. I know we ran longer than an hour, but the material was just too good. I couldn't help talking about it. And we'd love to hear what you think about it. So if you wouldn't mind, email us at glorycloudpodcast@gmail.com and head on over to the Meredith Kline Facebook page and let's continue the discussion there. Really love to hear from you. See you next week.